Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today, I'm excited to chat with Preety Sidhu. Preety graduated this past semester from Louisiana State University with an MFA in fiction. While at LSU, she worked as an editorial assistant at the Southern Review. Now she lives and writes in Maryland and works as an intern at Electric Literature. Preety, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. All right. So you've had some pretty unique experiences as part of your MFA journey that I think are going to be really informative for a lot of listeners. But before we get to that, I like to ask guests if they remember the first time they wrote something in which they realized the power of words and the power of writing. Did you have a moment like that?
Yeah, and I thought that I would never admit this to anybody if I became a more serious writer, but for me, it was Harry Potter fan fiction. Yeah. It was maybe a year or two after I graduated from my undergrad program that I had a summer job that left me with some downtime, and I got sucked into the Harry Potter fan community. And, I think that was the first time because as a kid and as a teenager, I made up like these imaginary worlds and stories as kids do. And, kept doing that when I was bored, but it never occurred to me to write them down. Uh-huh. They were really just, for me in sort of like a way that I process things. And so I think like reading fan fiction for the first time as I was like waiting for this last book to come out, was the first time that I was like, oh, wait a second, like maybe I can do this. Like I'm both enjoying this. There's this ready-made community of readers and there's like no barriers. So I can just like try it, put it out there and, get that instantaneous gratification of feedback from people who want to read this kind of thing. And I think I was just hooked. And I suppose, since I mentioned Harry Potter, I should also say that I've disavowed the author in her recent transphobic messaging that she's putting out there. So, I feel like I can't mention that without mentioning the other part. But, 15 years ago, that was a thing that got me hooked.
Yeah, that's fun. So you grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, right?
Correct.
What was that like? Like, did that influence your writing at all, like growing up there?
I think it has now. I don't think it did originally. I grew up in a very tiny town on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So we've had about a population of like 5,000 or 6,000 since the late 1700s. And it's still this like cute, charming colonial downtown area. And like everybody knows everybody. So, it never occurred to me as a setting for a while because it was all I knew. I think, and then I tried all different kinds of genre things that I never really thought to set anything here. I've moved a little more towards, after having spent some more time back here briefly between other jobs as an adult, I got to see it through new eyes. And now I think of it as a more interesting setting. And if I'm not sure where else to set things, I might do it in a fictionalized version of this town.
Yeah, I totally understand that feeling. I grew up in a small town and I remember growing up there and thinking it was just the most boring place in the entire world. And then, I got older and I actually went to other places and I remember thinking, oh, that place I grew up at actually was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's like you can't see it until you can see it through outside eyes. So a huge part was like having friends over that I had made elsewhere in the world, and they would come see this place. And one, like my best friend ever, was just like, oh, now you make sense. Now that I've seen your hometown, like I understand all these other things about you, and you make so. I was like, I have no idea what this means, but it's interesting to see it through other people's eyes, and then you can think of it as a setting.
Yeah, there's something about bringing people to your hometown and like showing them around and showing them those formative places of your childhood that can be really inspiring, I think.
Yeah. And each person, you're like, here's this person that I'm going to introduce you to because we pass them on the street, and like I can tell you 5 different things about them, and like how they know my parents and how they know my brother, and like, this, like I have all the backstory for the characters, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, so I'm curious. I mean, you grew up in Maryland, and then you ended up going to Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, which actually has some pretty good writers that went to that school, including Jonathan Franzen and James Michener. But you didn't study writing in college. You actually studied astronomy. So what made you want to study astronomy?
Well, my father was a physics professor, so that was a big part of it. I think, it's interesting to look back because as a high schooler, my dad sort of made sure that I got skipped ahead in math, but then an English teacher got to know me through like an SAT prep class and like skipped me ahead in English. So I was taking AP Calculus and AP English as a sophomore. And that teacher had said, make sure you take an English class in college. And I just didn't, because I thought like I already know what this is. And there's so many other subjects that I want to explore. And now I really wonder how things might have gone differently if I had taken that advice. But I had no idea what I wanted to major in. I took everything from computer science to art history and theater and cognitive science, math, having no idea, like right as the deadline came to declare, my dad was like, do the hardest science you can. And then if you want to switch to something else, like you would have already done the hardest science. So somehow he sold that. And I really did enjoy astronomy, like a lot at the undergrad level. I worked at the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI in California, Mountain View. One summer, and I worked on these slopestreak features that several years later NASA announced were in fact liquid water flowing on the surface of Mars, and I helped my advisors get a NASA grant to continue studying those features. So I feel like I've made my tiny mark in the study of life in the universe through that.
That's actually interesting to hear that like you didn't know exactly what you wanted to study, and then when it came time to declare, you went in a similar direction as your father. I had a similar experience actually, where I went to college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I loved writing and reading. So when it came time to declare, I decided to go in the direction of English education. I think at least partially because my mom was a teacher. So I ended up teaching, and you actually ended up doing some teaching after you graduated from college. Is that right?
That is correct. So I did try astrophysics grad school for a year, but I realized like at the grad level that it wasn't speaking to me the same way, or that, I think I enjoy doing things that involve people and human actors and characters more than I could spend an endless amount of time modeling rocks and atmospheres. So I did move in that direction to teaching math, which was really enjoyable for a long time. I think, relationships with colleagues and students are things that have been really formative for me and were really enjoyable. I was also writing on the side the whole time. So teaching seemed like a good career because I had the summers off, but I still got a paycheck. Or I could choose to have my paycheck split over the summers. And, certainly like endless ideas for characters and just learning all the different ways people could be, or, you teach a class of 20 kids math, like they're all going to respond to it in a slightly different way in these like individual personality quirks. Like teaching is actually a great way to get to know how so many different people's minds work.
I read where you said that you kind of decided to go in the direction of fiction because it was your favorite mode of interrogating human experience, which I thought was a really nice way to put it. But I read that you actually toyed with the idea of studying astrobiology or social neuroscience in grad school before settling on fiction. So what was it in the end that drew you to pursuing the MFA degree?
So MFA, I think there was a time where I just hit a wall with teaching math, at least for the time being. I had been going to writing conferences and literary events and author events, especially when I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There was just such a wealth of that stuff there. I was taking writing classes, and it still wasn't enough. Like, it still felt like the vast majority of my energy was going to teaching math, and also that at this point, I could teach different levels of math, but it wasn't really going to be different. Like if I'd been teaching algebra 2 and I now like expanded to pre-calc or calculus, that didn't feel like the direction that I really wanted to grow in. I wanted to see if I could bring writing from the periphery of my life and this thing that I had to do on the side and almost, keep quiet if I wanted to seem like a serious math teacher sometimes, to say, okay, like what if this is really my day job? What if I can wake up and like actually pour all my energy into this thing that I've cared about for so long?
Yeah. I was going to say, you would have to be a superhero to handle like a full-time teaching load of middle schoolers and high schoolers, and then also be able to write on the side.
Yeah. And there were times that I woke up at like 3 a.m. so that I could get an hour of writing in, and then I would, have to make tests and quizzes or grade and then go teach all day. And then I'd come back at 5 and be like, can I sleep yet? I decided to sleep for 3 more hours, but
So I imagine the idea of going to an MFA program where you have like dedicated writing time probably sounded pretty appealing to you.
Absolutely.
You don't have to get up at 3 a.m. to.
Yeah. Or if I'm getting up early, like, what's actually happening in the majority of my day is something that's going to improve me as a writer.
So you grew up in Maryland. You ended up going to Pennsylvania for college and then taught in the New York, Boston area for a while. How did you end up in Louisiana for your MFA? What drew you to LSU?
So I applied to a lot of places. I think the final number was somewhere between 15 and 20. And LSU, I think when I started this process, I thought, I'll live in New York or Boston, or I was looking in the UK or Vancouver. I thought, I'm going to go live in one of those places that feel like the kind of place that would be a good fit for my personality. But then I also really wanted a fully funded program, and the fully funded programs tend to be more in the middle of the country. So they were in Arkansas and Alabama and Louisiana and Wyoming. And, so that the vast majority of the 15 to 20 places I applied to were in that part of the country. And I think I had liked the Michener Center at UT Austin, which I know is a very coveted program because it has at least 3 years, full funding for everybody, a very light teaching load, and a lot of cross-genre opportunities. And I had identified those as things that are important to me. And then LSU had scored high in all of those categories as well. So it was really important for me. I only applied to places that fully and equitably funded everybody. So, if there were schools where only some people got scholarships, but other people were responsible for paying, for me, that felt like that it might create kind of a weird vibe, and that, I would be more comfortable at somewhere where I knew all of my peers were equitably funded, the same that I was.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, actually, because I was trying to find information on this program. I went to the LSU website, and it kind of seems like it hasn't been updated in a couple of years. So it was a little difficult to find information. From what I could see, it is a 3-year program, and it's described as being generously funded, which could kind of mean anything. So it is a fully funded program.
Correct. And and it had the other things that I had mentioned, that it was, it's 3 years. They never have more than a 1-1 teaching load. And there are many semesters, like your first 2, if you don't already have a master's, you're TAing, which is, less than being a full instructor of record. You're only in front of a class for about 50 minutes, that whole first year. So it had that, and it had a lot of cross-genre opportunities. So it scored high in all of the categories that I wanted. Full funding for LSU means about, I think we were getting about $17,800 per year, all 3 years. Everybody in the program gets that. So they're usually about 7 people to a cohort, give or take. It's usually a split between fiction writers and poets, but sometimes we'll get a nonfiction person or a screenwriter. And everybody who comes in is guaranteed that full funding for all 3 years, $17,800 for reference. And I recommend that anybody who's applying to a program do this kind of research on the places that they're getting offers from. MIT has a living wage calculator where you can put in a zip code and see what is a living wage for one adult with no dependents or different family structures in this zip code. And for East Baton Rouge Parish, it's about $24,000 a year. So $17,800 for 9 months. If you can get reliable summer work, that's not bad. Or if you're, have other ways of making it work, which I can speak to a little bit.
Well, yeah. I mean, when I hear 17,800, I think that sounds pretty good. That's above average for MFA stipends, but it is all dependent on cost of living and some of those hidden fees. And you mentioned that you applied to 15, 20 programs. I'm like doing the math in my head, and that's a lot of money, isn't it?
It cost about $1,800 for me to apply to all of those programs. And I would, for your listeners, there are some good resources for people who may not be able to put up that kind of money and still want to apply to programs. I can recommend the Facebook group MFA Draft. And I know that there are threads on there and there's support on there for if you are a low-income applicant and you need to navigate fee waivers and possibly deferring your GREs and things like that. There are definitely people on that Facebook group who can guide you. Also for Black, Indigenous, POC, trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming people, there's something called MFA App Review, where someone who's either a current student at a fully funded program or a recent graduate of a fully funded program will be paired with you and mentor you one-on-one and look over your personal statement and give you feedback on your the creative portion of your application. So I just wanted to make sure somewhere that I worked in that information for applicants.
Great. Yeah, thank you. It's really good information. I spent a bit of time on the MFA Draft site when I was applying, and it really was a good resource. I was there mostly for moral support, but yeah, it was really helpful. A lot of people on there are really helpful in answering questions that you might have about the application process.
Yeah, so 1,800 for applications, and then to cycle back to the 17,800 at LSU. There are the other big piece of advice that I have for applicants, or at least people who've gotten offers, is to talk about hidden costs of programs, because there are some major hidden costs at LSU. We have the highest grad fees in the country. And that's not just for the MFA program. That's people, grad students across all disciplines who are going to be paying something like, it's close to $4,000 a year. So actually with 17,800, I was taking home more like 1,300 or 13,000, sorry.
Right.
So they just take a big chunk out of it. They were not particularly forthcoming. So the offer letters said that there are fees, you're responsible for them. A lot of programs may have tuition waiver and a fee waiver. LSU did not offer the fee waiver, and it made a big difference. I still would have done the program even if I had known that, but I do think it's something that they should be more upfront with students about, because I know students who may have reconsidered if they knew. And then the other thing is, maybe the year I got there, they stopped offering health insurance. So that was those two things together actually turned into kind of a weird vortex for people, because then people in the program thought they could apply for state health insurance aid. And if they truly were making $13,000 a year, they would qualify for state aid. Whereas because on paper it looks like they're making $17,800, it looks like they're making too much to qualify for state aid. And so they can't get that, but then they also are paying that huge chunk in fees, so they really can't afford to buy their own health insurance, because what they are making is $13,000 is what they're actually taking home. And I know classmates who got caught up in the vortex of trying to get the right documentation and being unable to do that. And neither the state nor the school was particularly helpful or caring about that.
So several years back at the University of Missouri in Columbia, which is part of my system, I go to the University of Missouri in Kansas City. In Columbia, the school attempted to take away health insurance from grad students, but there was some collective action that overturned that decision. So was there any push for that at LSU?
There was. I think there were some unionization efforts. The health insurance was gone by the time I got there. I don't know exactly when it went, but I think it was tied to the passage of the Affordable Care Act that they could suddenly reclassify us as students rather than employees, so they weren't responsible for our health insurance. So there were some attempts to unionize my first year, but they did not particularly take off. And then it was quiet for a year or two. And then this past year, we were able to unionize with United Campus Workers, which is under Communications Workers of America. So just in 1 year, we were able to get a membership of, I think we're about 150 now. It may have gone up since I last checked. And that's across all disciplines. So we had a lot of physics people and biology grad students. We had faculty, we're open to staff. Really anybody getting a paycheck from the university could do that. But grad fees and grad health insurance were like high level issues. So that's at least a way of banding together. And, if that had been there when they tried to do it, there would have been more pushback. So at least now that's there. So
because LSU is a fully funded program, I assume all the students in the program are teaching, or are there some students that are on fellowships?
So there were a few people who I think came, more on the PhD side because our cohort was about 7 MFA students and then about a dozen PhD students. So we had people who were there on Fulbrights or other fellowships.
So for the majority of MFA students who go to LSU, they are going to be teaching. And so that's really good information for them to know that they'll have that union available to them.
And they don't have to be I'm sure it's a right to work state. So, but they would have the option to join that union. And I joined it when I was working for the Southern Review, which replaced my teaching appointment. And also being the editor-in-chief of New Delta Review could be a replacement for a teaching appointment.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So, from what I could tell on the website, some of the biggest draws of the program are the publications that are there on campus. So you mentioned the New Delta Review. What was your experience like working there?
So that, is a really fun labor of love that a lot of the MFA students participate in. And I think the PhD students and people from other departments are welcome to be a part of it as well if they feel passionately about publishing. So that is something that's available online. You can go find the website and read the issues. And they have nonfiction, poetry, fiction, maybe hybrid or other experimental things, interviews and reviews. I was the interviews and reviews editor my first year, but then I was not particularly involved my second year. So that's a chance for anybody who wants to get experience as a reader and reading submissions, which I think is a really valuable part of growing as a writer, is just reading what other people are submitting for publication and honing your instinct about what's good or not, what you would want to publish or not.
Yeah, and the New Delta Review publishes some really good stuff. And you also worked as an assistant on the Southern Review, which has been around since the beginning of time, I think. So
I think this is our 85th year.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
2020, yeah.
So you mentioned that reading submissions, can be really helpful for you as a writer. So I'm wondering if, after working at the Southern Review, if you have any advice for people who are thinking of submitting to a really good journal like the Southern Review, if you could talk to that a bit. And then also if you could maybe tell us how reading all those submissions has affected your own writing.
Yeah, I guess those are probably very closely related questions. And I think for me, I almost have not done much short story writing because I was focusing so much on my thesis novel the entire same year that I was working at the Southern Review. I haven't really sort of sat down and reflected hard on this, but I think that it's given me a sense of what, it's helped me develop a sense of what I would be excited to publish. And for me, I think that tends to be fiction that in some way speaks to a broader cultural conversation. So there's, whether it speaks to something like climate change or immigrant experiences or, whatever else it might be. There's so many things going on in the culture, but it tends to, if it's providing a fresh angle on some important conversation, so it has that broader relevance, I think that definitely helps stories. The writing quality really matters a lot. I would say the things that don't matter so much are who the author is or what they've published. So I, usually don't read the cover letters until after I've read the sample. And I could say that there are probably plenty where the person had a long publication history and possibly a prestigious job title, and may even have been teaching in a program somewhere. But if the story itself wasn't good, then none of that particularly mattered, right, for us deciding to publish it. So it had to be the story first, even if it was from, an unpublished writer or someone we'd never heard of. We would love to discover someone new.
Well, I think that's good to know, because I talk to a lot of emerging writers who maybe don't submit as much as they should because it seems like such an intimidating process. And, a lot of them seem to have the idea that you can't really get published unless you've already been published, which, makes it difficult to ever get published.
Yeah. And I think, that's not true at all. I will say that it has not made it easier for me to come up with good ideas for my own story. So that remains as difficult as it ever was. It has made it easier to discard ideas that are not good or not good enough. So I think me pre-Southern Review may have had an idea and been like, that's pretty good, and spent a lot of time trying to develop it before realizing that something about it was not going to work. I think I've speeded up that instinct to say now I can have the idea in the shower and get rid of it in the shower, being I know that's not the right story for me to write, or I don't have enough of a personal connection, or I would have to, that's not a good idea, even if it felt like it for a moment.
Right.
So that filter has gotten much sharper.
That's great. And speaking of influences on your writing, you mentioned that LSU has a lot of opportunities for cross-genre work. I read that LSU offers workshops in fiction, poetry, drama, screenwriting, and literary nonfiction, which is pretty unique. And I heard that your writing process was at least partially informed by a TV writings forms class you took there, which sounds really interesting. So can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So my second year in the fall, I took a TV writing forms class with Mari Kornhauser, who has worked on some Netflix series like Treme with David Simon, who also did The Wire. And that was a different approach. I think before I got to the MFA, I read a lot of craft books about here's character development and here's how you think about the different beats of a plot and so on. And so I came in with that kind of mindset, and then workshop was something very different. It would never be so prescriptive as to say, this is what your process should be. So we only talked about what a writer was able to get on the page and how it's working or not. So TV writing was the place where we cycled back and saw, where we really focused on process of, how do TV writers do it? There's actually an industry standard of, okay, we need to make a story. What do we have to start with? Okay, maybe it's just a setting. Then, how can we think of all the things that might happen in this setting? How do we develop that? How do we, get everything in place, character Bibles, season arcs, A plot line, B plot line, C plot line, and turn it all the way into a script. And I think going through all those planning stages and then doing a final project that was a pilot script, I wrote that pilot script in one day in about 14 hours, but it was one of the most enjoyable, liberating writing experiences because everything was so planned. I just looked at my thumbnail and I was like, oh, I can hear the dialogue, and I just did it. So I had so much fun with that. that when it came time to plot a thesis novel, I was like, okay, now I know the system that works for me. I'm going to do that. So I'm going to, act break my novel into 5 acts and an epilogue. I'm going to, fill out these character Bible sheets so I'm not wasting space on the page trying to work out characters' backstory that could have just been on that character sheet for me to refer back to when I need it. And I think probably the biggest thing, so my process was for my thesis year, I started in June with a NaNoWriMo style. If you're familiar with that, it's the National Novel Writing Month,
right,
where people write like 50,000 words in 30 days. And I'd done that before, during my teaching years. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do 60,000 words in 30 days, just 2,000 words a day. I can jump around to any part of the story and write whatever I feel like writing that day, as long as I get to 60,000 in the calendar month of June, which was easy to do. I think I finished several days early. So like once I had that really rough sketch, I was able to like act break it and to do thumbnails. So I went for each chapter and like wrote a paragraph, which like sometimes ballooned into a page. And then I was like working on this for several weeks. So I would think of some like subplot, and then I would go through and like write it into every chapter thumbnail where something should happen. And this actually gave me too much. Like that ended up being a 20,000 word document that I could then refer to for the rest of the year. And I had way more than I needed to write a novel. So I ended up with this like 400 page novel, which is like too long for a first novel. It was 120,000 words, and it should probably be no more than 90,000. And it was like too much focused on one section. And so I was rushed in other sections. But, in terms of at least like hitting a page count and giving my thesis committee a whole completed story to read, using that TV writing process definitely like helped me gather, organize, and then like plow through that material.
Yeah, it just shows you how different process can be from one person to another. Because I talked to some writers who swear that they never outline anything, that they have kind of a seed for a story, and then it all comes to them through the process of writing it. But then I've talked to other people who do outline extensively. I remember when I first kind of wanted to start writing short stories, I'd been writing some short scripts, and I found that if I wrote the script first, it was kind of like an outline with the dialogue, and I could use that to then write the short story. Nowadays, I don't outline anything, but like I remember at the time that was really important for me to actually start and finish projects instead of just starting and letting it fizzle out halfway.
Yeah, I've tried that too. Like when I've been stuck, I thought, let me try just a script. So I'm only focused on this like one element dialogue, and then I can imagine all the stuff that's happening, and that will become the rest of the story.
Yeah.
I may have to try that again because I have not tried to bring this process to bear on a short story. So I tend not to outline my short stories, but then I also struggle to finish short stories and to make them good. Like I think novels work better for me. So maybe I could find a way to apply that process to short stories. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. They're so different, aren't they? Like, the novel is just such a beast that I imagine outlining at certain points would be almost necessary to keep it all straight in your head.
Yeah. And it helps to do that top level, here are just the biggest turning points in the novel. Then what needs to happen in each act, you can sort of fill it in until you have like that paragraph per chapter or something ready to go.
Well, you've brought a section of a short story that you're working on currently. Are you okay with reading that now?
Absolutely. All right. So this is called The Dark Deep. I lean forward, arms planted on the edge of the boat, wetsuit clinging to my body in the oppressively humid late February air. The scene looks just like it does in the images the alumni office sends each year in their annual bid for donations. The top third of the old campus bell tower still juts out of the water, its thin Gothic windows, laced in stone tracery, soaring into pointed arches just below the battlements. It always strikes an odd note for me when they send this image in fundraising appeals. They probably think that the part that sticks out of the water is a symbol of endurance or something. The spirit of the place living on, even though all campus functions are scattered and remote now, have been for almost a decade. But how could anyone look at that partial bell tower and not think of all that lies submerged in the watery depths below? We almost didn't come. When I first floated the idea, Andrew asked if I didn't think that so-called historic dives are ghoulish and unnecessary, even when the divers don't have any personal attachment to the sites they're exploring. I could see it in the tense hunch of his shoulders when our friends Leah and Annette showed us the footage from the mall dive they'd done with their kids last summer. We watched schools of fish swarm past the entrance to a Sephora, undersea mosses growing happily on the once gleaming copper pots in the abandoned Williams-Sonoma. The kids, Leah laughed, had been so shocked that the mall was only 2 stories tall and sprawling, though the shallow depths are, of course, what make them perfect dive sites for exploring with kids. Malls these days are about 40 stories tall, but take up no more than a city block. When the coasts flooded, real estate prices in the middle of the country shot up, especially in the cooler, higher elevations. Metro Denver, where Andrew and I live, looks like the financial district of Manhattan used to only decades ago, and it's as sprawling as Los Angeles once was. We are far from there now. In the distance, through the sun glare setting the water's surface aflame, I can just make out the partially submerged skyscrapers of what used to be Center City, Philadelphia. It's not ghoulish, I'd told Andrew back at our apartment, it being the rise in dive tourism to parts of the country that had now been underwater for at least 5 years. It's our history. Why shouldn't we look at it, remember what it used to be like? And, I went on, nobody died at my school. They vacated the campus a year or 2 before the worst of the storms. It's not like we'd be exploring a place that had a high death toll. We're not going to find bodies they never recovered. Andrew's like the least confrontational guy, so when he argues, it tends to be by asking gently suggestive questions. Don't you think it's just going to make you sad, though, Neha? Like picking at a wound so it never heals? He knows that if I make it to a 3rd or 4th glass of wine, rare these days, but it happens sometimes, odds are I'm going to pull up dive videos of the street where I grew up, of my favorite old museums and stadiums and restaurants and whatever, of my college, and watch them while listening to music that reminds me of those times. I try not to let any tears fall in front of him, but I do occasionally slip off to the bathroom for a good cry, and he's probably figured that out. It's not like seeing it is going to bring back that life, right? He'd pressed. Isn't it just going to be a painful reminder of what you've lost? No, I said. I think it might be more like an important way to reclaim it, you know? I mean, I've seen your school, obviously. Andrew had graduated from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He'd grown up his whole life in the greater Denver area, so he could never really grasp what it was like to miss the coasts. He'd enjoyed summer beach vacations in California with his family, and the landscape of his hometown had changed significantly as well. So he claimed he knew, but clearly it wasn't the same. And for a while, it felt like the chance to show you mine in person or to see it again myself was something I've lost forever, but really it's not. We can still go there. It will be very, very different, but we can still go there. I've seen the pictures, Andrew shrugged. You've shown me the dive videos plenty of times. I can imagine what it's like. Not the same. Anyway, this is something I really want to do for myself. I'd love it if it was something we could do together. So probably because he couldn't think of anything else to get me for my birthday last year, he'd gotten me diving lessons at an indoor swim complex. Does this mean? I'd asked, tilting my head and refusing to assume anything. He'd grinned. Then I did too. Yeah, if it means that much to you. You're just going to keep thinking about it until we do it. And I guess I am curious to see anything you're that excited to show me. The boat takes a sharp turn to the left, and the ragged claws of bare treetop branches poke out of the water ahead of us. Now that we're here, I'm feeling the pressure to deliver something spectacular. I hope it will be. Something that makes the expense, the flight, the 3-hour chartered boat ride from the pier in Harrisburg unequivocally worth it. Behind me, I hear the sound of flippers slapping the deck and turn to see Andrew making his way over. He beams and sweeps his arms around, like he's gifting me this whole scene all over again. His goggles are nestled in his reddish gold hair, and his face is sweating profusely. I'm sure he can't wait to get in the water, and I can't either. How are you feeling? He asks, placing his hands on my hips and nestling his chin on my shoulder. Then, without waiting for an answer, want to tell me what we're looking at here? Absolutely, I chirp, pointing at the bell tower. That's the tower, so I slide my finger. Right down the hill from it would be the dining hall. I spin to face the front of the boat. Over there is the library. It's this big fortress-like building with slit windows, like where archers would sit to fend off an invading army. You'll see. We pull level with the sunken trees, and the boat's engine cuts out, leaving us rocking there in sudden silence. Come on, says Andrew. Let's go get the rest of your gear on. I lead the way. As we round the prow of the boat, the square, quadripartite dome of the main building comes majestically into view, slate gray and ribbed in white. It's about twice as tall as the boat, and so close I could swim out and touch it in under a minute. The tattered shreds of a flag still hang limply from the pole at its center, which is wobbling and clanking in the breeze.
That's great. Thank you so much for reading that. I have to say, I feel a bit uneasy hearing the descriptions of the campus functions being scattered and remote, seeing how that's happening now with the pandemic. I mean, there are dystopian elements to this piece, and it used to be that you could read dystopian fiction and feel at least somewhat removed from it. But nowadays it feels more and more like we're living in it. So I'm curious, did that reality affect your writing of this at all? And do you think that will affect how your readers might read this piece?
So this was something that I started and revised like entirely after the pandemic itself started. So this is something that I just first started writing in April and then revised again a little more recently. So it's not an accident if, some of the mood of right now is what's creeping into this. And I think that might be a thing that writers are struggling with now, and that, we want to write about the pandemic, but I could immediately put on my editor's hat and say, like, unless we were doing a special issue or something about the pandemic, especially for the lit mags that I read for, we tend to be picking things for like months down the line. And it's hard to pick a pandemic story and know that that will still be good if it comes out in December. Right. Or, it's just, maybe you have to go through the whole thing before you can really look back and know how to write about it, even if it's on people's minds. So for me, thinking about different disasters that are not the pandemic, but that still feel relevant. So I felt like climate catastrophes felt, they're sort of an evergreen dystopia until we solve climate change.
Right.
That plus there was just something that appealed to me about the setting. Like, I don't know scientifically if a setting like this makes a tremendous amount of sense, but the idea of being able to like dive through the wreck of something, but the wreck of something is your old life, was just interesting. So I think what I have right here is sort of like a premise and a setup, but like, where does it, sort of what are the present day stakes or something that I'm still asking myself. And sometimes coming up with good short stories is a matter of like, oh, here's like a great setting, or like, now what story am I going to like plant in this setting? What's at stake for the characters? How is this going to change them? What are they going to discover about themselves or the world? And I don't quite have the answer for that yet. So, when that part comes to me, then I'll have a whole story, I think.
So do you find that after that comes to you, do you go back and fully rewrite the story, or do you just revise the sections you've already written to try to work that in?
I think like once I am able to put pieces together and know that it works, like I have no problem rewriting the whole thing several times. I think, that's the only way to sort of smooth it out and make it work.
It's a little easier with a short story than with a 400-page novel draft, right?
Although I think it's what I'm going to have to do for the 400-page novel draft as well. That's going to need at least one more revision.
Yeah. Is that novel something you were working on the whole time you were in the program?
Not particularly. I think, it probably plays to some themes. I'm interested in sort of twisty relationships, and that probably came through in a bunch of stories. But I think my first 2 years in the program, I was also taking lit seminars because that's a big part of the program at LSU, is that you take at least 4 lit seminars alongside PhD students. So I think I tended to take whatever I was focusing heavily on, be it Greek tragedy or Renaissance drama or noir or American Gothic, and try to like work those elements into my short stories and tell whatever story I needed to tell like in that mode. But then when I went to the novel, I just went back to a sort of contemporary realistic setting.
And so you mostly worked on that novel your last year in the program?
Correct.
Okay. Well, like the majority of the novelists that I talk to say that it takes them 4 or 5 years at least to write a novel. So I guess if you're at the point where you have to go back and rewrite it one more time, like maybe that's pretty normal, right?
I think so. Like my sense is, by the time someone has a novel published, they say that, it took 5 years or 10 years by the time they've gone through like the whole querying and publishing and all of that process. This year may have like condensed like a year or 2 or 3's worth of work into a shorter amount of time, but it's not the entire timeline.
Right.
That I needed to produce a first novel.
Right. So I'm curious, speaking of writing the thesis and speaking of the pandemic, what was your thesis defense like? Was it done via Zoom?
So I was so lucky that I got it in right before the pandemic really hit. So I got it in even before Mardi Gras weekend in mid-February. I had no idea what was coming. But it was really lovely because, I felt bad giving these 3 wonderful professors 400 pages to read in a month, but they got through it all. It was just incredible to have that experience of, sitting with people who've like entered your imaginary world and like really gotten to know your characters, and they remembered things that I forgot that I had put in there, and they had such thoughtful questions. And I loved talking about it with people who had read the entire thing and asking them questions about things that I was still struggling with. So it, went on for an hour, and I could have sat there for 2 easily if
cool.
They didn't have other places to be. So it was a really lovely and affirming experience.
That's great. And in general, did you find that the professors were pretty supportive throughout the program?
Yeah, they were fantastic. I think, every individual professor that I worked with, I really enjoyed working with. They all have very different personalities and styles, but it was good to hear a lot of different people and their input. And so I loved getting to work with all of these different people. I would say the one thing that was a little bit challenging at LSU specifically is that because it is such a small program, there was a lot of turnover. So I don't think I ever worked with the same professor more than one semester.
Oh.
Some of that was my own choice. Some other people may have gotten to work with the same person if they took them both. But, people retired and went on sabbatical and went on, they got research grants. They went on medical leave. There were people who were just visiting professors for a year. They got fellowships. There was just a lot of, it felt like there wasn't that much continuity.
Okay.
I didn't particularly mind. Like for me, the flip side of that is that I get to hear from a lot of different voices. And I think, I hadn't worked with my thesis advisor before the thesis, where they tell you, try to pick someone who knows your work. Well, nobody who knew my work was available as a thesis advisor. And I think it worked pretty well. Like, my advisor was great and kept me accountable, and I think like getting then that perspective, and he asked a lot of good questions, and it forced me to articulate what I was trying to do. And I think it worked out well. So I think if I had gone in there really excited about one specific person, I may have been disappointed. Mm-hmm. But I think because I was open to just whoever was available, and because everybody was good and cared, it worked out okay.
Yeah. Well, speaking of writers coming and going, there's also this visiting writers series that I read about on the website, as well as the Delta Mouth Festival there at LSU. And so I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit, which writers maybe visited while you were there, and if either of those things were affected at all by the pandemic your last semester.
Yes. So the Visiting Writers series brought one fiction writer and one poet, or one prose writer, sometimes it was nonfiction, and one poet to campus each academic year, so one per semester. And that visiting writer would spend a week on campus, and they would work with undergrads, and they would teach grad seminars, and they would host Q&As about publishing. They would give a public reading. And we had some... we had Hari Kunzru, who's a fiction writer, Douglas Kearney, the poet, Carmen Jimenez Smith, the poet, and Alexander Chi for nonfiction, all while I was there. And it's fun because awesome. You get to go out and, have dinner with them and, really pick their brains about the writing profession. Unfortunately, my third year, the school cut funding for that because they had originally given only temporary funding, and they decided not to renew it my third year. I'm hoping that the professors put in grant applications again and are able to revive that in the near future because it was a really good part of the program. And then there's the Delta Mouth Literary Festival, which happens in early April. Mm-hmm. Most years, and that's entirely put on by MFA students. So anyone who's looking to add arts administration experience to their resume or is interested in organizing literary events, that's a great opportunity. Sometimes it's a class, sometimes it's a volunteer thing that you don't get course credit for. They switch back and forth between a few different models. But they bring about 8 up-and-coming writers to campus for a 3-day festival that's entirely free and open to the community. So they do have to do a lot of fundraising to be able to pay the honorariums. And it's usually people who have had a book coming out in the last year or have one that will be coming out later that year. So we've had a lot of really cool people through that too. Aro Kwan, right before the Incendiaries came out. Kiese Lemon was there for Heavy. Chen Chen, Joss Charles, some really cool poets. And again, we get to have meals with them and drive them around and sometimes host them, and they give readings and, they get to hang out with each other too, which I think they have a lot of fun doing. So it's, it's a really cool thing for Baton Rouge because otherwise we don't have that many author events or, not too many indie bookstores or things like that. So this
sounds
sort
amazing.
Of fills that gap. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really
it sounds
cool.
Really fun. And I love that it's free and open to the community to come. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And so was it affected this year by the pandemic?
Yeah, it got canceled this year because of the pandemic. So that was rough. I think they can't, we stopped going to campus about 3 or 4 weeks before that was scheduled to happen. So they really didn't have a choice. Everything was canceled.
Yeah. It's a pity. But hopefully that's back next year. And also fingers crossed, hopefully that visiting writers series comes back to LSU because that sounds amazing. Yeah, that was fantastic. Those were definitely some of the most memorable experiences of my time there. So it would be a great thing for the school to support. Yeah. So since graduating, you've moved back east. You're Correct. Working as an intern for electric literature. I'm curious how you ended up with that gig and how that's been going so far. Yeah, so this was actually a silver lining of the pandemic for me because I'm not sure that I would have gotten this. I think they've only ever held them in person before, which meant that the interns had to live in Brooklyn and come into the Brooklyn office a few times a week. Because of the pandemic, they offered one person who's local to Brooklyn, and they said, we're going to open it up to one person who can be entirely remote. And so I just saw the listing because I followed the editors or people who work for Electric Lit on Twitter, as I follow many other literary figures on Twitter. So I saw that in early April, and I thought, what the heck, I have no idea if I would be competitive for this, but I love that site. I love a lot of the things they put out. I can do this right now, I think. So I put in my application, and they do it in multiple rounds where they make you show samples of work and show that you understand the aesthetic and the values of that site. So I just kept doing those rounds, and they offered the job, and I was ecstatic. So that's going to be a 3 to 6 month gig. And I'm hoping it leads to something longer term in the similar vein. Yeah, I mean, it's a great site. I go there and to LitHub a lot, and they both put out some really good stuff. So you mentioned your hope is that it'll lead to something more. Are you hoping that it'll lead to something more at Electric Lit or at another publication?
Yeah, I would love if it led to something more at Electric Lit. There is an opening now that I've put in an application for, but whether or not that works out, like I, would keep an eye on them for future openings one way or the other. So I'm glad that they're getting to know me and the way that I work, and I hope they like that. So I would love for it to be there. I think there are a lot of people who work there and multiple places, including LitHub, and do similar things, editors at one place, maybe staff writers at another, or people maybe fulfilling the same role in both places. So, I would be happy with other literary organizations that are doing similar work. Before the pandemic hit, I had been thinking of literary nonprofits like Grub Street in Boston. I know Blue Stoop in Philadelphia is another one, places that gather resources for writers, support writers, hold classes for writers, hold conferences for writers. Grub Street was really, really helpful to me in the years that I was both teaching and trying to get better as a writer. And I think the courses that I took through there probably helped a lot. The connections that I made at the conferences helped a lot because people reviewed my writing samples and my application stuff for MFAs. So I think all of that helped me tremendously. And if I were to go back to teaching, I would like it to be through an organization like that. I don't know what the future looks like for holding the kinds of amazing literary conferences that these places used to hold, but I'm hopeful that like some version of this like comes back into the real world when it's safe for it to do so. So I think for me personally, I do not see myself returning to academia at the moment. High school teaching, possibly in English or creative writing, like that is an option, though with the pandemic, I don't know that I'm particularly
and revising
at the top of my list.
Yeah. And revising that 400-page novel.
Yeah, that absolutely. And I saw a really good piece of advice that I'm excited to apply to that, which somebody said after you've done one full draft of a novel, what you should really do is like a dozen outlines, like not one outline for your revision, but like think of all the different ways the timeline could play out or the narration could play out, and the structure could play out, and like just keep playing with it and maybe show those to people and see like which would actually make the best book of like all the ways your book could be arranged.
Well, it sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds like fun work. So I'm really excited to read the novel in whatever form it ends up being in. And, I think you just have such a wealth of experience in both the workforce and in the MFA program that I think the information you provided today is going to be super helpful to anyone who's considering applying to MFA programs. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.